Mnemonics are clever memory devices designed to make it easier to remember things. But considering that they take time both to create and retrieve, are they really that useful for learning Chinese? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we're going to talk about mnemonics, or more specifically, whether or not mnemonics are too slow for learning Chinese. For those who are not familiar with the word, a mnemonic is a mental technique used to improve our ability to remember things. And you're probably aware of such techniques, even if you might not have used the word mnemonic to describe them. To give you a common example from a school context, you might have used a sentence to remember the order of the planets. My very excellent mother just served us nachos, where the first letter in each word corresponds to one of the planets, so Mercury, Venus, Earth, etc. Some of you might also be familiar with methods where you try to remember things by placing them in a physical location, so either a memory palace or perhaps the method of Loki. The most fundamental principle of learning anything effectively is understanding. And understanding something unfamiliar and new usually means being able to connect it to something familiar and known. This allows us to make sense of it, but it also allows us to retrieve the memory later, and it's therefore the key principle behind effective learning. Learning something completely new, entirely devoid of context, and without connecting it to old information is very hard. For example, trying to memorize Chinese characters as jumbles of strokes is very hard. It's much more difficult than identifying components and connecting those together. And once you know many of these components, learning also becomes easier, because when you encounter a new character, you can connect it with characters or character components you already know. This is also partly why mnemonics are so useful. They are a way of connecting something you want to learn with something old that you already know, and doing so in a way that allows you to recall it later. This connection can be fanciful, made up, or whatever you want, as long as you remember it. So, for example, in the mnemonic about the order of the planets, there is nothing that connects nachos to Neptune, except of course that they share the first letter. If they didn't share any connection at all, it wouldn't really work as a mnemonic. But it's not the case that nachos, the meaning nachos, has nothing to do with the planet Neptune. We use nachos here instead of Neptune because it forms a funny sentence that we can remember, and the point of the mnemonic wasn't to learn the names of the planets, we assume that you know that, but rather to remember the order. In that case, an N, as in nachos, is all you need because there is only one planet beginning with an N. As already mentioned, these connections should be bizarre or stand out in some way, because that's a good way to tell our brains to pay attention. If you create very logical and normal connections, that's not really something you will remember later. It could be argued, for example, that the sentence used to memorize the order of the planets is a little bit tame. I mean, I didn't learn that sentence growing up, and I looked it up when I wrote the article that this episode is based on, and I actually forgot it between writing the article and recording the episode. If you don't like that version, maybe you can try this version from XKCD. Mary's virgin explanation made Joseph suspect upstairs neighbor. So again, the same letters, but a different sentence, and maybe this one is easier to recall. This highlights an important point because people remember things differently, and some mnemonics are very good for some people and some don't work that well. And so experimenting and trying out and learning what works for you is important. And this is also something that has been checked experimentally, for example by Ko and Hooper 2004. And if you want more research articles and further reading, please check the written article on Hacking Chinese. Mnemonics can of course be employed in many areas of learning Chinese, perhaps specifically Chinese characters, but also vocabulary in general and some other things. I've written about these things a lot on Hacking Chinese already, and I will provide some links in the show notes. But in this week's episode, I want to focus on the speed, or the problem that creating and recalling words using mnemonics takes time. And does that mean then that they could perhaps be too slow for us? What if you need to think for 5 seconds before you come up with your mnemonic and you connect it to the right word and then say or write it? Doesn't that mean that the mnemonic itself is just too slow? Before we try to answer that question, I think it's important to point out that there is ample evidence, both anecdotal and scientific, that mnemonics are highly effective in the short term and that there are many ways you can improve your memory. This is not something you're born with, and everybody can learn to use memory techniques. For example, in a paper by Dressler et al., the brain activity of top memory champions were compared to that of normal people, and it was found to be quite different, which is not strange. But then the normal people in the test group also got to practice and learn about mnemonics and memory techniques, and it could be seen that 6 weeks later, after going through some training, their brain activities started to shift towards the memory competitors. This, along with many other studies, suggests that this is not an innate ability. It is indeed something that can be learned and practiced. It is in fact quite easy to show how effective mnemonics are for short-term learning. So, for example, if you give a normal person a list of 15 objects and ask them to try to remember it, most people will remember around 7 ± 2 items on that list. But if you ask them to tell a story using these 15 items or connecting them to each other in memorable ways, they might recall all of them. And if they have some practice doing this and how to create powerful mnemonics, they can recall all 15 of them quite easily. And this does not take 6 weeks. It takes more like an hour. If you want more insights in how to use mnemonics to learn, for example, Chinese characters, please check the links in the show notes. But as I mentioned, in this episode I want to focus on one of the most common problems raised with mnemonics, and that is that they are simply too slow. When you speak a foreign language, you can't stop for a few seconds, use your fancy story, and only then be able to say the word you want to say. You need almost instant recall for spoken Mandarin, and it can be argued that if you take a few seconds to recall every single character you want to write, this is also too slow. So are mnemonics too slow for Chinese learners? I think the answer is no, and I think people who say that they are too slow have misunderstood the purpose of mnemonics and maybe also a few other things. The argument is that when you try to recall the order of the planets, this is usually something you can take a few seconds to do. So if someone asks you what's the closest planet to the sun, and you say, oh, that's easy, that's Mercury, then you already have a few seconds to think when you say the first bit, and coming up with the answer is pretty simple. And even if you did have to think an extra second or two, this is something most people won't blame you for. As established, however, spoken language is not that forgiving, and if you need to think just a few seconds about several words in a sentence, talking with you becomes unbearable. Broadly speaking, I think there are 3 reasons why mnemonics are still useful and why they aren't too slow, and so let's have a look at them in turn. Number 1. Slow recall is better than no recall. Even though it's true that it's not good to wait a few seconds before you come up with the word you want to say, this is still preferable to thinking for a few seconds and then coming up blank or not being able to say anything because you forgot the word. The more times you try to recall a word, the faster it will go, and so this is usually a problem only if you speak very little Chinese, and that's going to take time and be awkward no matter what. If you're using mnemonics for something very specific, like tones, it can also be nice to confirm that you know the tone of a word without having to look it up, which you can definitely do by using mnemonics. But if you don't do that, you will have to use a dictionary or verify some other way that the tone you're saying is indeed right. Second, sometimes slow recall is not a problem. This is particularly true if it doesn't happen too often. Let's say you're an intermediate learner and you know 2,000 characters. You're more than 200 times more likely to encounter the character ta, he, him, the 10th most common character, compared to pao, bubble, the 2,000th most common character. If you need to think a few seconds before recalling ta, this is a problem, but if you need to think a few seconds for pao, that is less of an issue. This is in fact true both for speaking and writing, although of course speaking is more sensitive. Third, mnemonics are just stepping stones. The mnemonic is not necessarily there to end all your review needs for a specific character, so you don't study it, create the mnemonic, and then never look at the character again until you need to use the mnemonic on a test or something. Instead, mnemonics can be stepping stones to a more intuitive knowledge of the character. So the next few times you encounter it in a text, for example, you might not immediately be able to recall it without the mnemonic, but thanks to the mnemonic, you do recall the character, and that also enables you to do it next time and slightly faster, and after a while you don't need the mnemonic anymore. For example, if you create a mnemonic for the character xiang, to think, as a beginner, this makes sense. You will be able to nail it on your Tingxie or your dictation exam, but after a while this mnemonic will fade. As an intermediate student, you will have seen, read, and written this character many, many times, and so you don't need the mnemonic anymore. This doesn't mean that the mnemonic was useless and you shouldn't have created it in the first place, it just means that it's played out its role. So in essence, it's not a problem that it takes time to recall something via a mnemonic. It would be a problem if the mnemonic is all you have for recalling the information you need and you never practiced in any other way, but this is not true using any sane approach to learning Mandarin. As mentioned, it can be true for rare characters or words that you don't encounter or need very often, but then again, thinking a little bit is not an issue in those cases. And if in the situation you're in, thinking a few seconds is a problem, I still think that you'd agree that it's better to be able to recall the word at all, even if slowly, compared to drawing a blank and not being able to say or write anything. As mentioned earlier in this episode, I have written more specific, concrete articles about how to use mnemonics to learn Chinese, so please check the show notes for more information and inspiration. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.